They say every marriage has secrets, but I never imagined mine would lead me here, lying in bed, tangled in sheets that still smelled like him, my body aching from a night that never should have happened. My husband was downstairs, oblivious, sipping his morning coffee, while I lay there reliving every forbidden moment with the one person I should have never touched. I'm Alice Jordan, and this is my confession. On the outside, my life was perfect. I was the ideal suburban wife, my hair always neat, my smile always warm, my home always in order. Richard, my husband, was a respected businessman, and we lived in a beautiful home in an upper-middle-class neighborhood in Ohio. We had everything people dream of: security, comfort, and a love story that looked flawless from the outside. But behind closed doors, our marriage was far from perfect. Richard was a good provider, a faithful husband, and a man of routine. But when it came to passion, there was nothing. Our love life had been dull for years, reduced to quick, predictable encounters that left me feeling unsatisfied and alone. I tried to accept it, to tell myself that love was about more than physical connection. But as time passed, loneliness became my shadow. Then came Jamal. Jamal entered our lives when he was 16. He had grown up in foster care, moving from home to home, never truly belonging anywhere. When Richard and I met him through a local mentorship program, something in me felt drawn to him. Maybe it was his quiet strength, his resilience despite everything he had been through. Richard was the one who suggested we take him in, and I agreed without hesitation. I told myself it was motherly instinct, that I just wanted to give him a stable home. At first, that's all it was. For years, Jamal was simply our son in every way except blood. I cooked his meals, helped with his homework, and cheered for him at his high school games. When he turned 18, he went off to college but still visited us during holidays and weekends. And then, somewhere along the way, things changed. He was no longer a boy. He came back from college at 22, taller, broader, with a quiet confidence that wasn't there before. The young man who now stood before me was not the same lost teenager we had taken in. His voice had deepened, his presence had grown more commanding, and when he looked at me, something inside me stirred, something dangerous. It wasn't just Jamal's presence that shifted something in me. It was what I lacked in my marriage. Richard had always been a man of schedules. His life revolved around business meetings, golf outings, and watching the evening news at precisely 7 p.m. Our intimacy, if you could even call it that, was no different: brief, predictable, and uninspired. I had done everything to reignite the spark. I bought new lingerie, suggested vacations, even tried initiating moments of passion myself. But nothing worked. He was always too tired, too distracted, too indifferent. And I was starving. Not just for intimacy, but for attention. For passion. For something that made me feel wanted. Jamal noticed things Richard never did. He saw when I changed my hair. He complimented the dresses I wore. He laughed at my jokes. And when he looked at me, really looked at me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: desired. That feeling terrified me. I told myself I was imagining things. That it was just a passing thought, a silly fantasy brought on by my loneliness. But deep down, I knew better. The moment I realized I had crossed an invisible line was on a warm summer evening. Richard had gone on one of his business trips, leaving the house unusually quiet. Jamal and I sat on the back porch, sipping iced tea, the air thick with humidity and something unspoken. We talked about everything, his dreams, his struggles, his future. And then, somewhere in the middle of a conversation, he looked at me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "You ever feel like you're meant for more than this?" he asked, his voice low. I swallowed hard. More than what? This routine. The same thing every day, no passion, no excitement. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, it felt like he wasn't just talking about himself. The air between us shifted, thick with tension. I felt my pulse quicken, and suddenly, I realized how close we were sitting. How his arm brushed against mine. How his gaze lingered just a second too long. I should have gotten up. I should have changed the subject, gone inside, done anything to break the moment. But I didn't. And that was the first mistake. I should have walked away that night. I should have gone inside, locked the door, and prayed for forgiveness. Instead, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the way Jamal had looked at me. It wasn't just in my head, I knew that now. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Desired. Alive. And that thought scared me more than anything. The days that followed were unbearable. I tried to act normal, to pretend that nothing had changed. But every time Jamal was near, my body betrayed me. The way his voice rumbled when he spoke. The way he absent-mindedly ran a hand over his jaw. The way his muscles flexed when he reached for something on the top shelf. I hated myself for noticing. At night, when Richard was asleep beside me, I turned my back to him, biting my lip, forcing myself to think of anything else. But no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts drifted back to Jamal. To the way he had looked at me. To the possibility of what could happen if I let go of my guilt. One evening, about a week after that night on the porch, I found myself alone in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with more force than necessary. Richard was in his office, buried in work as always, while Jamal sat in the living room, flipping through a book. I stole a glance at him, hoping he wouldn't notice. But he did. "You okay?" he asked, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah. Just tired." He watched me for a moment before setting his book down and walking toward me. My heart pounded with every step he took. "You've been different," he said, leaning against the counter. "Distant." I let out a nervous laugh. "Just busy." "Busy?" His eyes held mine. "Or avoiding me?" My breath caught in my throat. He knew. He saw right through me. I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things. But then he reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. His fingers barely grazed my skin, but the sensation sent a jolt of electricity through me. I froze. This was the moment. The last chance to stop this before it spiraled out of control. But instead of stepping away, I leaned into his touch. It was innocent. At least, that's what I told myself. Just a brief moment, his hand lingering against my cheek, my eyes fluttering closed as I savored the warmth of his skin. And then, just as quickly, I pulled away. "I can't," I whispered, shaking my head. He didn't move. Didn't push. Just stood there, watching me with those dark, unreadable eyes. Why? The answer should have been simple. Because I was married. Because he was my adopted son. Because this was wrong. But none of those words came out. Instead, I turned away, gripping the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles turned white. "You should go to bed." A long silence stretched between us. Then, finally, I heard him sigh. "Good night, Claire." I didn't turn around. I didn't watch him leave. But long after he was gone, I stood in that kitchen, my hands trembling, my heart pounding, knowing that I had already lost the battle. After that night, everything changed. I tried to keep my distance, but it was impossible. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch, every moment alone with him felt like a test of my self-control. And every day, I felt it slipping away. One afternoon, while Richard was out of town on business, I walked past Jamal's room and found the door slightly open. I knew I should keep walking. Instead, I hesitated. Inside, he sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone. The soft glow of the sunlight through the window cast shadows across his face, making him look even more breathtaking than I wanted to admit. He looked up, surprised to see me standing there. "Everything okay?" No. Nothing was okay. But instead of saying that, I stepped inside. "I just wanted to check on you," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He tilted his head, studying me. "Are you sure that's all?" My pulse quickened. I was playing a dangerous game, and we both knew it. I should have turned around and left. But I didn't. And that was the second mistake. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside me. Rain hammered against the windows, the sky dark with rolling thunder, but my mind was consumed by something far more dangerous. I stood in the dimly lit hallway, my heart pounding, my hand hovering over the doorknob. On the other side of that door, Jamal waited. I knew if I stepped inside, there would be no turning back. I had spent weeks fighting this, ignoring the tension, avoiding his gaze, pretending that nothing had changed. But the truth was everything had changed. And tonight, I was about to break every rule I had ever sworn to uphold. Richard was out of town for the weekend, just like always. His job took him away so often that I had learned to live with an empty bed, with the silence of a house that was far too big for just me. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with something unspoken. Jamal had spent most of the evening in his room, and I had done my best to stay away. But as the night stretched on, the loneliness clawed at me. I poured a glass of wine, hoping it would dull the ache inside me. But it only made me more aware of the warmth of the house, the sound of the rain, the fact that I wasn't really alone. When I heard footsteps behind me, I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. "You okay?" His voice was low, deep, laced with something I couldn't quite name. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Just couldn't sleep." Neither of us moved. The air between us felt electric, crackling with the tension that had been building for weeks. When I finally turned to face him, his eyes held mine, searching, waiting. And then, without thinking, without planning, without considering the consequences, I kissed him. The moment our lips met, the world tilted on its axis. It was soft at first, hesitant, both of us testing the boundaries we knew we shouldn't cross. But then, something inside me shattered. Every lonely night. Every unmet need. Every suppressed desire. It all came rushing to the surface. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss. My breath hitched as I felt the strength in his arms, the warmth of his body against mine. This wasn't careful. This wasn't controlled. This was passion, the kind I had long forgotten. I should have stopped. I should have pulled away, apologized, pretended it never happened. But I didn't. We pulled apart just long enough to breathe, our foreheads touching, our breaths ragged. Reality crashed down around me. "This is wrong," I whispered, but even as I said it, my hands remained on his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. He looked at me, his gaze unreadable. "Then why does it feel right?" I didn't have an answer. Because in that moment, nothing had ever felt more right. I barely slept that night. Not because of regret, because of anticipation. My mind replayed every second, every touch, every stolen breath. But morning brought reality. The weight of what I had done settled over me like a heavy fog. I avoided Jamal at breakfast, keeping my eyes on my coffee, my hands trembling as I stirred my spoon. I thought he would act differently, awkward, guilty, distant. But he didn't. He acted normal. And somehow, that made it worse. Because I wasn't normal. I was unraveling. And I knew this was only the beginning. Great. I'll modify the story to explore the emotional conflict, guilt, and consequences of infidelity while ensuring it fits within ethical guidelines. Here's the reworked version of Chapter 4. It had been weeks since the night everything changed, and the guilt clung to me like a second skin. I told myself I could control it. I could stop before it got out of hand. But with every passing day, I found myself slipping deeper into a web of deceit. The lies became easier to tell, but the truth gnawed at me with increasing intensity. This was no longer about desire. It was about something darker, something that threatened to unravel everything. I told myself the affair wasn't real. After all, we hadn't gone further than a few stolen kisses. It was just a fleeting moment of weakness, a desperate reaction to years of loneliness. But every time I saw Jamal, every time he looked at me with those knowing eyes, I couldn't deny it anymore. The connection we shared was deeper than anything I'd ever experienced before. The thrill of secrecy was addicting. We exchanged subtle touches, lingering glances, and words that were never meant for anyone else to hear. It wasn't about the physical. It was about the connection, the way he made me feel seen, desired in a way I hadn't felt in years. Each stolen moment felt like a small victory against the loneliness I had been enduring in my marriage. But with every victory, the cost grew. At night, when Richard would come to bed, I would close my eyes and pretend everything was normal. But the weight of my secret made it hard to breathe. I began to avoid Jamal, to pull away, telling myself it was for the best. I was hurting Richard, I reminded myself. I was betraying him in ways that went far beyond anything physical. But then, the temptation would be too much. It wasn't just about what I was doing to Richard. It was about who I was becoming. One evening, after a particularly intense interaction with Jamal, I found myself sitting alone in the kitchen, staring into my cup of tea, overwhelmed by shame. I had convinced myself that I wasn't like this, that I was better than the lies I was telling. But in that moment, I wasn't so sure. Jamal was the one who found me. He didn't speak at first, just stood by the door, watching me. "I don't want to hurt you," I finally whispered, the truth spilling out before I could stop it. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You're not hurting me," he said softly. "You're hurting yourself." The words stung. Our stolen moments continued, each one wrapped in secrecy, each one pushing me further into a spiral I couldn't control. I had convinced myself that Richard would never know, that our marriage would remain intact. But deep down, I feared what would happen if the truth ever came to light. Jamal and I became more careful, more distant from each other when Richard was around. But even in the quiet moments, there was always that unspoken tension between us, a tension that neither of us could ignore. Richard began to notice changes. Little things, a sigh when I looked at him, a slight distance in the way I spoke to him. He never questioned it directly, but I could see the confusion in his eyes, the suspicion that he couldn't put into words. It wasn't long before I couldn't lie to myself anymore. The affair wasn't just about passion, it was about a need for something more. I had convinced myself that I could find a way out of this mess, that I could somehow fix what was broken. But the more I tried to push Jamal away, the more I realized that I couldn't. One evening, after a tense dinner where the silence was thick enough to cut through, I found myself alone with Jamal once again. This time, there were no stolen glances, no gentle touches. There was only the realization that I was about to lose everything I had worked for. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice shaking. "This has to end. Before we both destroy everything." Jamal's expression softened. He nodded, his gaze intense yet filled with understanding. "I know. I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know how to stop this either." The air between us was thick with the weight of our words, and as I looked into his eyes, I realized that, for all the guilt I was carrying, the one thing I couldn't let go of was him. But it was time. For both of us. The truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply we bury it. The whispers, the looks, the things left unsaid, they all pile up until they can no longer be ignored. And when they surface, there's no escaping the fallout. I never imagined the pain that would follow. The guilt of what I had done overwhelmed me, crushing me in ways I wasn't prepared for. Richard found out, of course, he did. The signs were too obvious. The changes in me, the way I couldn't look him in the eyes anymore. The confrontation was inevitable, and when it happened, the words cut deeper than I could ever have imagined. Richard's hurt was like a dagger to my heart, a consequence of my own making. Jamal was gone soon after. We never spoke again. I spent months trying to rebuild what was broken, but the damage was done. I lost myself in the process, and though the scars healed over time, the guilt remained. I thought about that night often, about the choices I made, and the person I had become. And I knew, deep down, I would never be the same.